So began the morality of the Cold War. Anything goes. The struggle required a mentality of permanent war, a perpetual state of emergency. And it meant a vast new apparatus of power that radically transformed our government. Its foundations were laid when President Truman signed into law the National Security Act of 1947.
Now, that National Security Act of 1947 changed dramatically the direction of this great nation. It established the framework for a national security state.
Admiral Jean LaRocque rose through the ranks from ensign to become a strategic planner for the Pentagon, and now heads the Center for Defense Information, a public interest group.
The National Security Act of 47 gave us the National Security Council. Never have we had a National Security Council so concerned about the nation's security that we were always looking for threats and looking how to orchestrate our society to oppose those threats. National security was invented almost in 1947, and now it has become the prime mover of everything we do is measured against something we invented in 1947. The National Security Act also gave us the Central Intelligence Agency.
This is the house the Cold War built, the CIA, the core of the new secret government. Its chief legitimate duty was to gather foreign intelligence for America's new role as a world power. Soon it was taking on covert operations, abroad and at home. As its mission expanded, the CIA recruited adventuresome young men like Notre Dame's All-American Ralph McGehee.
I look back to the individual that I was when I joined the agency. I was a dedicated Cold Warrior who felt the agency was out there fighting for liberty, justice, democracy, and religion around the world. And I believe wholeheartedly in this.
Thank you for joining us back here on Just Conspiracy. Rather than talking about what's going on right now and a court case that's going on right now, we're going to look back into our past. Because I maintain, and I've talked here about if we had courts of law on the local level at home, and law was respected by everybody, that is the only way we will ever see justice at the highest tiers of our government. There is no way to have justice at the highest tiers of our government if we don't have justice on the lowest tiers of our government. Typically on this channel, I'm talking about county courts, family courts, violations of law, violations of rights. But this time we're going to look at a different court. And I wish for you, while we're doing this, to think about what a court is, what law is, how it applies to you. Because if we do not see how it applies to us, we're going to keep making mistakes. We're going to keep making errors. And I also maintain, while I talk about this court of law and how good it would be for ourselves and our posterity's future, I also maintain that the history of government and courts, way back in the day, when it was all centered around temples, very open temples that have statues of gods telling the people how to act, what to do, setting the societal norms. And then they were judged by priests, by high priest. And today we have the same thing going on because Congress, Capitol, the Capitol building is a temple to Jupiter in Rome. And they create something called statutes, which is a lot like statues with a cross in between the U and the E. And they have to have our faith, they have to have our worship to get our energy and do things all around the world in the name of that temple, in the name of the Capitol and the gods who reside there. Of course, this presentation is going to be about Ronald Reagan. I personally like Ronald Reagan. His political speeches from the 60s are some of my favorite. And I really wish that politicians would get back to a day where they talk to people's hearts, because that's what they used to do. But in this story, in the Iran-Contra story, it's completely different. Sometimes people who can show you the biggest heart in the world can also show you the evilest. And the main reason why I picked this particular situation is because it has all of the elements of a really corrupt government and a system that's out of control. So without further ado, let's see how Ronald Reagan sets up his cabinet, uses the power of the presidency, and the power of these national secrets.
Our foreign policy has increasingly become a military policy. Ronald Reagan has doubled the number of military men on the staff of the National Security Council. What was created in 1947 as a civilian advisory group to the president has become a command post for covert operations run by the military. Far removed from public view and congressional oversight, they are accountable only to the one man they serve. The framers of the Constitution feared a permanent state of war, with the commander-in-chief served by an elite private corps who put the claims of the sovereign above the Constitution.
This is the first page of an order signed and approved by President Reagan.
This is the ultimate weapon of the secret government, the National Security Decision Directive, the NSDD. Every president since Harry Truman has issued them. They're not published in any government register. Ronald Reagan has signed at least 280 such directives. They cover everything from outer space to nuclear weapons to covert operations in Iran and Nicaragua. In essence, by an arbitrary and secret decree, the president can issue himself a license to do as he will, where he will. And the only ones who need to know are the secret agents who carry it out, the Knights of the Oval Office.
How does it happen that to be anti-communist we become undemocratic, as if we have to subvert our society to save it? This is partly the answer. The powers claimed by presidents and national security have become the controlling wheel of government, driving everything else. Secrecy then makes it possible for the president to pose as the sole competent judge of what will best protect our security. Secrecy permits the White House to control what others know, and that's power. How many times have we heard a president say, "If you only knew what I know, you would understand why I'm doing what I'm doing"? But it's a self-defeating situation. Someone said, everything secret degenerates, even the administration of justice. So in the bunker of the White House, the men who serve the president put loyalty above analysis, and judgment yields to obedience. Just salute and follow orders.
The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon, that the United States undercut its allies and secretly violated American policy against trafficking with terrorists. Those charges are utterly false.
The president was not telling the truth, and when he held a news conference the next week, the pattern of deception continued.
Mr. President, I don't think it's still clear just what Israel's role was in this. Could you explain what the Israeli role was here?
No, because we, as I say, have had nothing to do with other countries or their shipment of arms or doing what they're doing.
That wasn't the truth either. Half an hour later, the White House press office corrected the president. Israel had been a key player in the sale of arms to Iran. Rapidly now, the web of secrets was unraveling. On November 25th, the president's old friend and ally, Attorney General Edwin Meese, revealed the deepest secret of all.
Certain monies which were received in the transaction between representatives of Israel and representatives of Iran were taken and made available to the forces in Central America which are opposing the Sandinista government there.
I know you can't believe it. A president lying on national TV. That's just so out of this world. Nobody would ever believe it ever happens. The only thing I can't believe is why so many people believe them when they're talking. with how many times government and government personnel have lied to the American public and have been caught at it, I don't see why we continue to believe them. If I ever had a friend in my life who lied to me that much, I couldn't trust anything they say. I couldn't trust anything they say. And it's bad enough that we're selling arms to Hezbollah in Iran. That's bad enough, but that's another story for another day. This video is not about that. This is about the Nicaraguan people and the Sandinistas and their government in Central America. And who are these people? And why on earth do we feel the need to have some type of proxy war with them?
6 years into the conflict, some basic questions still need to be asked. Why is the United States engaged in this struggle? What is different about this war? Why these people? Why here? There are only 3 million people in Nicaragua. Per capita income is $720 a year. This is what is known in Washington as third world poverty. Yet these people live close enough to the United States to see how we live and to mimic the symbols of our prosperity. Since July 1979, Nicaragua has been ruled by the revolutionary Sandinista Front, a government that has committed the nation to radical change, for better or worse.
You're asking how life has changed since the revolution? Twice as good, 40,000 times. We have land, we have money, we have technical knowledge. Compared to what we had yesterday, when we had nothing, we are the owners of the land today. We have, as I was telling my friends, a little bit of everything.
The Sandinista revolutionary goals are planted in barren soil. It is a nation of peasants who work with oxen instead of tractors, machetes instead of machines. Like the other small nations of Central America, it is a country that is devoutly Catholic, underdeveloped, desperately poor. These are the people who must learn a new national anthem, proclaiming their own independence and their attitude toward the U.S. as well. The Yankee, they sing, the enemy of mankind.
One of the biggest questions that arises when covering the Iran-Contra scandal is why the United States were so concerned with a tiny country that in no way posed a threat to their safety. In 1979, Nicaraguan leftists, the Sandinistas, overthrew a longtime U.S. ally, the ruling Somoza family, and formed their own government, which created some of the most effective social reforms in the hemisphere at the time, that were praised by organizations like the World Bank and Oxfam as an outstanding example of participatory democracy. Despite the country's lack of abundance in resources, reforms in the early 80s provided a steadily increasing quality of life for its people. The award-winning Nicaraguan literacy campaign, introduced in 1980, dropped public illiteracy in Nicaragua almost entirely, reducing it from 50.3% to 12.9%. The Sandinistas were also able to provide Nicaragua with a national healthcare system that reached the majority of its citizens, reducing mortality by approximately half despite an ongoing war. This posed a unique threat to the Reagan administration, the threat of a good example. If a poorer and weaker country could provide a better life for its population than a country with more money and more resources, people would start asking questions. When people start asking questions, it's not good for business.
Yankees, the enemy of mankind. Those are very, very powerful words. I wonder where those people get that kind of idea. Maybe we'll figure it out going through this story, looking at it, trying to see where they're coming from. And what was America's threat? What was the threat to us? The threat of a good example. The threat of seeing people improve their lives by themselves without help or support from the free market. Taking a bad situation, choosing to make it better, developing and executing a plan to do so. That doesn't sound like reason to be concerned. That doesn't sound like reason to invade a nation. But they nationalize the lands, and you have corporate owners. We can't let them nationalize the lands. That sounds too much like communism. That sounds too much like communism. We can't let the leftist win. The only problem is, where do we get the authority to go after them? How do we convince Congress? We got to get the communists.
2 months after his inauguration, the president approved the funds which Casey used to create the Contras. Their ultimate goal was the violent overthrow of the Nicaraguan government, a government the United States legally recognizes. So the war had to be carried out covertly as a campaign of terror. But Americans were outraged when CIA agents mined the Nicaraguan harbors and blew up fuel tanks, causing thousands of Nicaraguan citizens to flee their homes. Congress, in protest, cut off the Contra funds.
A war can be lost in Washington as well as on the battlefield. So a move in the Congress to cut off Contra funds means the proxy war has a public relations problem.
Without objection, it's so ordered. Mr. Chairman.
In Miami, the Central Intelligence Agency sets out to improve the image of its proxy army by recruiting a moderate civilian leadership among Nicaraguan exiles. In this hotel, the head of the agency's Central America team talks to Edgar Chamorro, an exiled businessman.
There's a lot of selling of the Contras, when I talk to these people, they were interested in seeing this as a product that have to be sold to the American consumer or to Congress. So there was a lot of salesmanship in the process. They needed
Who was doing that?
The CIA.
13 days before the crucial vote in Congress, the new Contra leadership, including Edgar Chamorro, is presented to the press.
The CIA sat with us. We had yellow pad, everybody, and we were like in a brainstorm session, saying, how do you talk to the press? And then one of the CIA people or whoever it was would ask a question and says, what do you say if they tell you, do you talk to your American officials? I say, of course, we'll say, no, don't say that. Say you never talk to them. And somebody else will drop a question and say, what if they ask you, where did your money come from? I say, well, from the United States. Don't ever say that. You have to say it from private sources.
Have you had any discussions with an employee of the U.S. government about your struggle? And if so, when and about what?
No. Dr. Chamorro, with all due respect, you can't come here and expect us to believe that you have no links with the military situation there. This is not happening in a vacuum.
Congress buys the story, accepting the administration's claim that it is only stopping arms to El Salvador, not making war against Nicaragua. They authorize more money to the CIA, provided it is not used to overthrow the Sandinista government. The so-called Boland Amendment has the effect of ratifying the secret war, not curbing it. The Boland Amendment has no impact whatsoever on the war on the ground.
The Constitution is ambiguous on many things, but not on this. The President, quote, shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Yet President Reagan himself approved selling arms to Iran. And as for the illegal diversion of funds to the Contras, well, the President's National Security Advisor said the decision had been his.
I made a very deliberate decision not to ask the president so that I could insulate him from the decision and provide some future deniability for the president if it ever leaked out.
So the war starts. Proxy war, all over a bunch of lies. The government, the Reagan administration, they gotta get money to keep financing their proxy war. Because apparently providing mercenaries, guerrillas with arms to overthrow a government, well, that's not exactly legal in international law. Probably for a good reason. Because we probably wouldn't like it if somebody did that to us, huh? So what does the CIA do? They create a propaganda campaign. They tell their assets to lie to the media. What's the harm? Nobody's under oath. Nobody's under oath. We're just telling them what they want to hear, just to get our money. Just to get our money. And as long as we as Americans put that dollar before the good of ourselves and the safety of our family, we're going to live in a miserable world, and it's going to get more miserable. But I am absolutely shocked at how blatant and open they could just talk about it like that on national TV. Here's exactly what the CIA did. They lied to Congress, and Congress bought it, so they made a Boland Amendment of some kind. They told the president specifically they could not use funds, government personnel, government assets, and liabilities to conduct a proxy war. That the only money that was to go to Nicaragua was for humanitarian aid. Because we are a good, loving people like that. We see and we recognize that we have more, and we wish to go around the world and make other people's lives better. But that wasn't the plan. That was not the plan. The plan was to insulate the president from liability. For the CIA director to take the rap when this was exposed. But before we get to how it was exposed and what happened there, let's take a look at something that's very, very interesting. To have a war, you gotta have funding. So where did this funding come from? Where did the funding come from? Because we found that out during the investigation.
But how to keep the Contra War going despite Congress, the law, and public opinion? First, a small cabal in the White House took charge of policy. The President, CIA Director Casey, National Security Advisors McFarlane and Poindexter, and their aide, Colonel North, who did not wear his Marine uniform when he worked for the secret government. To raise money for the Contras, the secret team turned to right-wing governments that could do favors for the United States and receive favors in return. The King of Saudi Arabia doled out $1 million a month. The Sultan of Brunei coughed up $10 million that was misplaced through a White House error. The secret government also encouraged the fundraising efforts of General John Singlaub. Relieved of his command for insubordination in 1977, he now runs the World Anti-Communist League.
I represent hundreds of thousands of Americans who are sympathetic to your cause and want to help.
Here at home, wealthy right-wingers were solicited directly by Oliver North. Some of them were told their contributions would get them invited to the Oval Office. To get around the law, the White House then enlisted the services of something called the Enterprise.
The Enterprise is the group of companies that Mr. Hakim formed to manage the Contra and the Iranian project.
Who controls the Enterprise?
I exercised overall control.
General Richard Secord has been in and out of covert operations for a quarter century. One of the first Americans to fly secret missions in Vietnam, he also helped run the CIA's secret war in Laos. Secord became a major Pentagon figure in foreign military sales, especially to the Shah of Iran. Money.
Am I correct, Mr. Secord, that from December 1984 until July 1985, you were engaged in selling arms to the Contras for profit?
That's correct.
Then, at the direct request of the secret White House team, the enterprise brokered American arms to the Ayatollah Khomeini. Beyond Secord and Hakim, it grew to include a shadowy network of arms dealers, fraudulent companies, and secret bank accounts. The enterprise was, as Senator Daniel Inouye put it,
a shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
Secord purchased 1,000 missiles from the CIA for $3.7 million and sold them to an Iranian middleman for $10 million. On that one transaction alone, after expenses, the enterprise made a profit of $5.5 million, almost 200%. Its overall profits on the sales to Iran may have been as much as $15 million.
You did, in fact, use some of those proceeds, approximately, and correct me if my recollection is wrong, about $3.5 million for the Contra effort in Central America.
Yes, sir.
But most of the money never reached the Contras, including $8 million remaining today in a private Swiss account. Operating in secret, the enterprise was free to put profits above patriotism. They even sold arms directly to the Contras at a huge markup.
If the purpose of the enterprise was to help the Contras, why did you charge Calero a markup that included a profit?
We were in business to make a living, Senator. We had to make a living. I didn't see anything wrong with it at the time. It was a commercial enterprise.
Oh, I thought the purpose of the enterprise was to aid Calero's cause.
Can't I have two purposes? I did.
Hundreds of thousands of Americans support their cause. Not even 1 million. The man doesn't even say 1 million Americans support their cause. Just hundreds of thousands. I don't even think that's 1% of the American population the last time I counted. It's less than 1%. Huh, that's strange. Sell meetings with the president. Sell meetings at the White House. What else are we going to do? We are going to create a shell company that will buy, trade, and sell arms to our enemies, to Hezbollah, to people who kidnap Americans, and we're going to use that in this war against the people who are making us look like a bad example. On top of that, it would just be un-American of us if we did not make a profit, if we did not make a living at selling death and destruction. Because that's capitalism right there. That's the whole reason we are fighting the communists. The whole reason. Oh, and we also have to supply our nation with an enemy of bad guys to get the public consent that allows us to do this. What do you think the response is from the Sandinistas? How would you imagine that they prepare for this kind of attack subvertly from America?
More Soviet helicopters, tanks, and heavy equipment are added to the Sandinista arsenal. And U.S. aggression becomes the pretext for depriving political opponents of civil liberties.
We wanted to make sure that the United States was aware. A direct military intervention in Nicaragua would be no weekend affair, that it would be no picnic, that they would, if they came here, they would stay here, and if Americans die, then that is a heavy political price to pay back home, because Americans have been somehow educated into believing that the lives of other people really don't matter all that much. They don't say it that explicitly, But they really react if it's an American. It could be 100,000 Nicaraguans saying, who cares? But if it's an American, and that's why this is the diabolical nature of the thing, using people to wage a war with little political cost for the adventurer.
So you were going to raise the cost?
And so, but if they came here, we had to develop, we had to give the arms to the people.
Surprise, surprise. The Sandinistas, they buy weapons and armory from Russia. They gotta protect their borders. They gotta protect their homeland. Don't we have an issue with protecting our own border? Shouldn't we focus on that? They arm themselves to the teeth. And what does the president of Nicaragua say? He says, this ain't gonna turn into another Vietnam. I'm going to make it politically unpopular for your president to come down here with the military. Effectively kind of forcing the president's hand and to carry on this proxy war. I'm sure Nixon kind of looked at it like, well, I wouldn't even be carrying on this proxy war if they would just give up their power and give it back to American systems of government. So we just gotta keep on this proxy war. And why does the president of Nicaragua say that we can do this? You know, because he's from a different land, he's of a different color, he's gotta be ignorant, right? What does he say? He says, for some reason, Americans are educated that it's okay to kill other people as long as they're not Americans. Yeah, that's kind of nationalism. That's kind of nationalism and tribalism. Those are the things. But see, these things, they don't sit so well with the liberal left. Not the way far gone left, the communist socialist left. They don't sit so well with the liberal left that generally cares about their fellow mankind and does not wish to be their enemy. So, where do they get these troops from? Where do they gather the troops for this war? I'm glad you asked, because that's the next thing we're going to hear about.
Well, it was, for instance, a commander goes to a town in Nicaragua or close to the border, and he says, who are here Sandinista supporters? Then they identify 2 or 3. He shouts them in public. Then he asks the rest, do you want to follow me? Well, most people follow them.
Within 6 months, by the summer of 1982, the nature of this war is clear. The proxy army does not confront the Sandinista army in open battles. Its targets are mostly peasant villages.
They took them away. They took our men away. All of them. They took them by force. They took them with their hands tied behind them and a rifle right here. Oh, you're crying, the Contra said. We'll give you something to cry about.
In Nicaragua, the war is not fiction, it is real. And the Sandinistas begin to mobilize for a long and larger conflict. In 1983, all young men over the age of 16 are subjected to a national draft. To its architects in Washington, that means the policy is working.
As the Sandinista communist government tries to find the young men to push into its military, to grow to those huge sizes, the government of Nicaragua will become more unpopular, and more young men will decide to join the freedom fighters. And so I think what you'll see over time, provided the Congress supports the president, is the mass defection of Sandinista army units composed of young men who want democracy and don't want to serve in communist armies. And I think that as the tide of expectations turns inside Nicaragua in this political and military conflict, I think you will see the crumbling of the armed forces of the Sandinista movement.
And then the government collapses in the vacuum?
And then how the things will work out existentially is something that history will tell us.
Contra leaders, Contra commanders, they go into nearby villages where people are. Hey, who supports the government? You do? Bam! Not anymore. Who wants to follow me? Who wants to follow me? This sounds like really, really moral and ethical ways for the United States to spend covert money overseas. Maybe. And what does the Sandinista government do? They create a draft. Always politically unpopular. And because they create a draft, our CIA analysts estimate and calculate, because young men will hate going and fighting in their war, they're going to defect from them because the other man's grass always looks greener, and they're going to come over and fight our wars for us. This is what you're going to see. And you want to know how that logic results? You want to know what happens? Because in the end, we'll see, right? When it's all over, we'll look back and we'll see what worked and what didn't. And apparently that strategy, that particular strategy, just makes people hate us both. Hate the Russians and the United States. They're both evil. Down with them. That is basically how that strategy turned out, in my opinion. And how does the CIA keep this war going? Well, first off, Congress doesn't know about it. They're using covert funds. But it's completely out there and in the open and public with propaganda.
Nicaragua and its army cannot be allowed to win, so the CIA escalates the war, taking a direct role in the aggression. From a mothership off the coast, the agency conducts its own attacks. As detailed in this classified CIA document, dozens of sabotage missions are launched by the agency's own employees, a special force of Latin mercenaries. They are called unilaterally controlled Latino assets.
The missions were always controlled by the CIA. Those of us who fought, who were, so to speak, the cannon fodder, were Honduran. But we were controlled by the gringos. They gave us the orders. We were at their disposal.
While the mercenaries blow up refineries and mine harbors, U.S. pilots fly back up, firing on Sandinista positions.
We sabotage harbors, refineries, shipyards, bridges. We never use our own uniforms. We use Contra uniforms so that the foreign press will think the Contras were doing all the work and the Americans could walk away with their hands clean.
The U.S. directed attacks on economic targets, as well as the mining of harbors, are defined by international law as acts of aggression. But the administration continues to claim its secret war violates neither congressional restrictions nor national principles.
What does the propaganda say? Contra mercenaries did it. It wasn't the United States. We have clean hands with a lot of blood money in it. And nobody around the world is really buying this. They just can't prove it was the United States because they didn't have on United States uniforms. And the answer from the White House is, oh, well, all of this is above board. It's not against international law. Because that's why we call it a covert operation. A covered up operation. You're never going to win a war like that while the government controls the ground. At the same time, a government that controls the ground can never ever win an insurrection. That's what we learned in Vietnam. So why don't we try and go the political route? Why don't we see what happens when we get politicians to try and communicate with each other in a situation like this? Because to me, seems like the logical best route to go. Let's talk about it, not fight about it.
But the warnings that the military money will strengthen Honduran generals at the expense of democracy aren't welcome, especially to the U.S. ambassador.
He said that those in Honduras who were opposing U.S. policy as it is designed and is implemented, we are going to regret it. To be very frank with you, people at the U.S. Embassy here only listen to those who support them. If you oppose them, you are anti-U.S., you are anti-American. They are not willing to listen to you. They want to hear their own music.
The Pentagon calls it building a shield for democracy. Daniel Ortega calls it a practice session for the invasion of Nicaragua.
So I went and I waited for 5 days. Never anywhere in the world, anywhere else, have that happened. I'm waiting there in the capital of the United States for 5 days. And then eventually I'm told that the Secretary of State had to play golf in Atlanta. And would I not be amenable to meeting with Langford Motley? And I said, well, yes, I came very far, and I've been waiting many days. And so I met with Mr. Motley and presented our proposal. That weekend, Grenada was invaded, and the Secretary, I think, was still at the golf course in Atlanta.
After the invasion of Grenada, the Sandinistas moved to full mobilization. The U.S. response has made it clear that it has no intention of negotiating a settlement. A diplomatic agreement would leave the Sandinistas in power, and President Reagan wants them out.
Well, the political option appears not to be a go, because if you disagree with our ambassadors, we're going to call you a communist and look at you as the opposition, which will get more military warfare down here. That's what the people go for. That's what they go for. And the Nicaraguan governor, president, their leader, the Sandinistas' leader, comes to the United States to try and talk about it with the Secretary of State, because that's who you try and work out issues and problems of state with, is the secret keeper of that state, otherwise known as the Secretary of that state. And what does he do? He goes golfing. Because that's about the most hospitality way you tell somebody that you care about them and their cause and you wish to try and work it out. When they come up here and you got an appointment with them, you go golfing with your buddies. We all know that. That's what Americans do. And they carry on their criminal activity. The Reagan administration carries on their criminal activity. They got to get caught at some point, and they do. And when they do, God bless America, because we open up a court of law, we bring in cameras and lawyers and congressional hearings, and we broadcast it all over the land.
This lieutenant colonel is not going to challenge a decision of the commander-in-chief for whom I still work, and I am proud to work for that commander-in-chief. And if the commander-in-chief tells this lieutenant colonel to go stand in the corner and sit on his head, I will do so.
That notion troubled Senator Inouye, a combat hero of World War II. He reminded Colonel North of the military code of a soldier's duty.
The Uniform Code makes it abundantly clear that it must be the lawful orders of a superior officer. In fact, it says members of the military have an obligation to disobey unlawful orders. This principle was considered so important that we, the government of the United States, proposed that it be internationally applied in the Nuremberg trials. And so in the Nuremberg trials, we said that the fact that the defendant...
May I please
May
register an
I
objection?
continue my statement?
I find this offensive. I find you're engaging in a personal attack on Colonel North, and you're far removed from the issues in this case.
Colonel North's lawyer deflected Senator Inouye, but some of North's fellow officers watched.
The director was interested in the ability to go to an existing, as he put it, off-the-shelf, self-sustaining, stand-alone entity that could perform certain activities on behalf of the United States.
Are you not shocked that the Director of Central Intelligence is proposing to you the creation of a organization to do these things outside of his own organization?
Counsel, I can tell you I'm not shocked.
They were willing to literally put the Constitution at risk because they believed somehow there was a higher order of things, that the ends do in fact are justified by the means. That's the most Marxist totalitarian doctrine I've ever heard of in my life. If you can have a retired general and a colonel, in Mufti running around, making deals in other countries on their own, soliciting funds to wage wars to overthrow governments, and hide it from the American people so you have no accountability, you've done the very thing that James Madison and others feared most when they were struggling to put the Constitution together, which was to create an accountable system which didn't have runaway power, which didn't concentrate power in one hand so that you could have one person making a decision and running off against the will of the American people.
What could possibly justify it? The fight against communism, of course.
This nation cannot abide the communization of Central America. We cannot have Soviet bases on the mainland of this hemisphere.
It means dirty wars and dirty tricks, lying and deceit.
These operations were designed to be secrets from the American people.
Mr. Niels, I'm at a loss as to how we could announce it to the American people and not have the Soviets know about it.
Well, in fact, Colonel North, you believed that the Soviets were aware of our sale of arms to Iran, weren't you?
We came to a point in time when we were concerned about that.
Since our adversaries know about covert operations, the only people fooled are the American people. But consent is the very heart of our constitutional system. How can people judge what they do not know?
During your discussions with Mr. Casey, Mr. McFarland, and Mr. Poindexter about the plan, did a question ever arise among you as to whether what was being proposed was legal?
Oh, no. I don't think it was. I mean, first of all, we operated from the premise that everything we did do was legal.
And there was contempt for the truth.
Now, Mr. Mitchell, do you draw a distinction between not volunteering and lying?
Well, it depends entirely on the subject matter.
When you're asked a direct question and you don't volunteer the direct answer, you might say you're not volunteering, but actually you're lying on those.
Well, I think we'd have to find out what the specifics are of what particular occasion and what case.
Could you explain to me the difference that you think there is between knowing that you've left a false impression or a wrong impression and lying, to use an old-fashioned term?
Yeah, I think lying, we really mean, a deliberate effort to mislead people, to a deliberate effort to leave them with a misleading impression. What I hoped to do was to avoid the question and duck the question as I...
President Reagan's men did learn one thing from Watergate. Richard Nixon said it only last year. Just destroy all the tapes.
Where are these memoranda?
Which memoranda?
The memoranda that you sent up to Admiral Poindexter seeking the president's approval.
I think I shredded most of that. Did I get them all? I'm not trying to be flippant, I'm just...
Well, that was going to be my very next question, Colonel North. Isn't it true that you shredded them?
I believe I did.
Don't you just love how Oliver North, lawyer, interrupts Congress, interrupts the senator from Hawaii when he's talking about Oliver North's duty to disobey an unlawful order? Don't you think that's interesting? I think that's interesting. Perfect timing. Perfect timing. And that principle is so ingrained in our respect as a nation that we got it enforced at the Nuremberg trials. And the reason we did that is so that we would have a bunch of people to hang and show the public. Because all the real Nazi criminals, all the really high up officials, well, they got divided between the United States and Russia. Kind of ironic, huh? Over here it was called Operation Paperclip. And did anybody think that these actions they were taking was criminal or illegal? Why would they? They just presume everything they do is legit and above board. Even when Congress made a law directing them not to do this one specific thing. And they didn't understand. They're like, we're so busy watching other governments and paying attention to what they do that we don't know what our own government does, and we're also too busy to tell the American people about it. Yeah, that's kind of what I heard. I think this is just an atrocity. This is an atrocity. And it's an atrocity that keeps going on. Doesn't seem or appear to have end in sight. The only thing that's different is now they don't hide it. They tell everybody what's going on. They tell everybody, hey, we got to have $500 billion more to carry on this proxy war in Ukraine. Can we get that, Congress? No problem. Okay, let's take it over to Ukraine. You're not getting this $1 billion unless you fire your top prosecutor. It's not a quid pro quo. Really? Really? Now that we've heard their what they've done, what's their reasoning for doing it? And what do lawyers, what do constitutional scholars, what do they think about that and their reasoning? Can it all be explained away for our better good?
Testified that as a member of the National Security Council staff, you conducted a covert operation. And my question is, did the President specifically designate the National Security Council staff for that purpose?
I think what I have said consistently is that I believe the President has the authority to do what he wants with his own staff, that I was a member of his staff, that Mr. McFarlane was, and that Admiral Poindexter was, and that in pursuing the President's foreign policy goals of support for the Nicaraguan resistance, he was fully within his rights to send us off to talk to foreign heads of state, to seek the assistance of those foreign heads of state, to use other than U.S. government monies, and to do so without a finding.
Because they believed somehow there was a higher order of things, that the ends do in fact are justified by the means. That's the most Marxist, totalitarian doctrine I've ever heard of in my life.
Without a finding, there's a law which requires presidents to make a finding that the national interest will be served by a covert action and to report it to Congress in a timely fashion. The idea is to make sure that both the Congress and the executive, each elected independently by the people, are accountable for what is done in our name. But President Reagan gave himself permission to ignore the requirements of the law. And when he sold arms to our avowed enemy in Iran, he signed the finding after the fact and then ordered that it not be reported to Congress. The president becomes his own arbiter of the law in matters of national security. Or in Richard Nixon's words, when the president does it, that means it is not illegal.
I think it is very important for the American people to understand that this is a dangerous world, that we live at risk, and that this nation is at risk in a dangerous world.
The issue here is not whether we should pursue a foreign policy that guards against the Soviet Union. That's not the issue, because obviously, in significant ways, the Soviet Union represents a threat to our interests around the world and to our values. The problem is the excessive American perception of that threat, the pathological ways we construe that threat, and what it leads us to do. Because in addition to distorting our domestic priorities, to undermining our democratic civil liberties at home, in the end, arguably, it actually does damage to our national security.
There is a doctrine called the reason of state, that whatever is necessary to defend the state's survival must be done by the individuals responsible for it. Doesn't that take precedence over this 18th century set of values?
I think the survival of the state is what the Constitution is about. The reason of state argument is a very slippery thing, and at heart, at best, amoral. The idea
amoral?
Oh, you bet. I would say it ranges from amoral on the good side to just basically immoral.
Assume I'm president, and I'm going to say, Professor Firmage, that's all wonderful, but I deal in an ugly world. The United States is a wonderful place, relatively, because of this document, because of the values the founders inculcated in us. But the world beyond these borders is a pretty ugly world. People don't like us, people don't share those values, people are out to get us. And if I don't do the ugly things that are necessary to protect us from an ugly world, you won't be able to exercise the right of free speech out at that university.
I would say poppycock, Mr. President. That is simply nonsense. The whole fight is over means, not ends. Every president with every good intention and every tyrant with whatever his intention has used precisely the same argument. That is, don't constrain me by means and I will get you there safely and well. And I think any time we accept a reason of state argument to justify means that are totally incongruent with the values of our state, we're on the high road to tyranny, and we deserve to be there.
You know, they don't have to make a finding. They don't have to make a finding because they don't have to follow law. That's just something that historically there's a lot of precedent set that we don't hold people accountable who break the law. We just hold them accountable if they disagree with our policies. That's all. That's all, because we don't know what law is anymore. And the justification is we got to create an ugly, bad world out there. We have to make it really, really ugly and bad for other people so that you will appreciate the little bit we give you that much more. That much more. That's basically the argument. And what do the constitutional scholars say about this? They say that's never a good argument, because the argument is not about where you get at the end. The argument is truly about how you get there. And if we, as a culture, as a nation, as a free nation, allegedly, if we support the wholesale war, lies, deceit, murder, spying on other people, why wouldn't we accept those same things upon ourselves? And if other people can't stop it because our government has the power to do it, do we have the power to stop our government from doing it to us? Because when you support that kind of tyranny, when you support that kind of Marxist, tyrannical action, you're doomed to live under the same tyranny that you have created for others. You are doomed to be judged with the same judgment you have placed on others. The only question left to talk about is what are the long-term lasting effects for the Nicaraguan people? Long-term, how does this type of government, this type of security, this type of protection work out?
It is a longer-term problem that the United States has taken on, and we have to be patient enough to see it through.
But meanwhile, General, we are financing at least a modest level a proxy war against the Nicaraguan government.
That's what I read in the newspapers. I do not...
You didn't know that when you were in the government?
I do not
find that illogical or morally repugnant.
I'm not talking about morally repugnant. I'm talking about what is that supposed to accomplish if you have to wait for all of these other developments in order for the Nicaraguan people to see that they don't want the Sandinista government.
It reduces the freedom of action of the Sandinista government. It engages their armed forces. It is a way to alert the Nicaraguan populace and develop a degree of popular support that ultimately will result in an uprising and an overthrow of the government. It is a way to speed along the process. It does pose problems and put pressures on the Sandinista government that can be helpful in reducing the length of time required for this. What I'm really talking about is an evolutionary solution of the problem.
You're talking about 5 or 10 years,
perhaps.
The U.S. government did not tell the truth about its intentions, nor did it confront the real costs. And once again, an American cause has become someone else's tragedy.
Most people have these fantasies, enemies, or things in their head. So they are not fighting Sandinista, they are fighting themselves. They are fighting their own dreams, their own fantasies. And they get caught in this, and they end up believing it. So it's a kind of a self-deception, Because when you go and see the enemy, you find that these poor ignorant peasants, or these poor women, children, and so on, who their only problem is that they are poor and ignorant, and neglected. So I just one day wake up and said, this is crazy. This is insanity. Because we are inventing reality in our heads, and then we put it on people. And then we say they are communists. We need to label them to kill them.
By late 1983, the realities of war, as well as Sandinista mismanagement, have eclipsed their original goals. There is rationing instead of economic development. Instead of solidarity, there is popular discontent.
I am the father of a son, and I can tell you that lots of men have died in the mountains. It's not the fault of the people. It's not the fault of the people of the United States or the people of Nicaragua. It's the fault of the two governments that don't get along. That's what's happening in Nicaragua.
There's not going to be any change for as long as the war between the Contras and the government goes on. It's just going to get worse every day.
Communism is neither peace nor happiness. We want to live in peace and happiness, and these guys are only bringing suffering to Nicaragua.
Can you even believe this, General? I read about it in the papers. You mean you didn't have a government office in kind of that area of the world when those things were going on? That's not what I said. It's just my government office has not been indicted for those war crimes going on. Can you believe this? And the way he justifies it is, okay, yeah, we caused a lot of death. We caused a lot of destruction. We have ruined those people's lives. But it just gets us one step closer to our goal of crashing their communistic government. That's all it did. It's all justifiable because in 5 to 10 years, they're going to have a democracy. Well, the people living in this horrible situation, what do they say? They say, it's not the fault of the American people. It's not the fault of us. It's the fault of the two governments that can't get along. And I don't believe that they're talking about the United States government or the Russian government. I'm pretty sure they are talking about the democracy government and the communist government. The governments that are underneath our civil structures and keep secrets from their own people while exploiting those activities all around the world. All around the world. And what do they say? The beautiful young woman down there, she says, we just wish to live in peace and happiness. We don't wish for communism. They weren't communists. They just wish for peace and happiness and to be let alone. To be left alone. But politically, if you don't go along with our policies, we got to teach you a lesson because we don't actually teach criminals a lesson. We kind of reward their behavior. And we know that this is true. How do we know it's true? Because we laugh about it.
Lou? Mr. President, why don't we openly support those 7,000 guerrillas that are in rebellion against it rather than giving aid through covert activity?
Why, because we want to keep on obeying the laws of our country, which we are obeying.
I can follow up, sir.
Everyone in Washington seems to be in on the joke, including the press.
Doesn't the United States want that government replaced?
No, because that would be violating the law.
But, Mr. President, what is the American public to think?
And one of the lessons of it was that if the president could get away with violating the law that was on the books, it must mean that the presidency had a great deal of authority to ignore law itself.
Ha ha ha. Ha ha ha, that's right. We just laugh about it. We just laugh about the fact that the media is covering it up for them until they can't anymore. Then we have congressional hearings and let the media and Congress cover it up for them. We tell everybody what happened and then we tell them that's not what they heard. It amazes me. It absolutely 100% amazes me. And compare this with Trump. In my mind, this is almost kind of the best evidence that he didn't do it. Because we can't hold war criminals accountable for their war crimes, but we can hold Trump accountable for 36 false entries into a business record. Nothing else, after doing a lot of investigating. But what's the problem? We still have law and order. Everybody in the world knows it. They all know it. That's why Trump got indicted and arrested in the first place, is because we still have law and order. Because we don't even have to have propaganda campaigns anymore when we carry on proxy wars over in Ukraine. We don't even have to hide it anymore. That's how lawful we are. And what were Americans saying about this activity way back when it was going on? Let's find out.
All this, the contempt for Congress, the defiance of law, the huge markups and profits, the secret bank accounts, the shady characters, the shakedown of foreign governments, the complicity in death and destruction, they did all this in the dark because it would never stand the light of day. Secrecy is the freedom zealots dream of. No watchman to check the door, no accountant to check the books, no judge to check the law. The secret government has no constitution. The rules it follows are the rules it makes up. It confirmed that the common ingredients of the White House policies were secrecy, deception, and disdain for the law. We're airing the broadcast again because the public debate is about to reopen. 4 of the men you will see in this broadcast, North, Poindexter, Hakeem, and Secord, have been indicted on charges of conspiracy, obstruction, and fraud. This is how Americans like to think of their government. Its values are enshrined in beautiful monuments and noble inscriptions, the temples of our national faith. But for 40 years, a secret government has been growing behind these stately tributes to American ideals, growing like a cancer on the Constitution. It's what people were talking about this summer. They were talking about the abuse of secret power, a breach of faith.
Not everybody tells the truth. Not everybody thinks the public is entitled to know the truth. And not everybody thinks they should go by the law.
But I don't think we'll ever know the truth about what really happened. I mean, I feel like there's still lies out there, and we still don't know.
The thing I started thinking was, this must happen all the time. This time they just got caught.
Gail Jensen, Mary Lee Fithian, and Nancy Jones live in Minneapolis. Last summer, they organized citizens around the state to monitor the Iran-Contra hearings as a way of increasing public awareness.
The church I go to, we have a hymn that the words go something like, I wish that my eyes had never been opened. Because if they'd been opened, I'd have to do something about it. And I think that that's a problem with a lot of people in this country, is that they don't want their eyes to be opened because they're very comfortable, very secure, and if their eyes are open, they're going to have to do something.
The people that we're talking to have quite, they recognize that we're only talking about subverting the Constitution, that's all.
The American people are part of the checks and balances. It's not just the executive branch and the Congress and the judicial branch. The people have a role too.
It was all done in darkness because it wouldn't survive the light of day. Really? Because we shined a pretty big light on it. Nobody went to prison. Nothing really happened except for the secret government, the secret state, realizing it could get away with bigger and bigger offenses against the people and humanity. That's what really happened. That's what they really, really learned. And I feel for some of the other people who were talking, I know their struggle. I wish my eyes wouldn't have been open. Because now that I'm awake and I see the atrocities that are going on, I understand it's kind of up to me to do something about it. It's kind of my own individual responsibility and liability to make sure I don't participate and willingly give my energy and my time and my efforts to creating that kind of evil. And it's up to us. It is on us, the American people, the American public, to change this. No one else will change it for us. These capitals, these national buildings, they're symbols of our faith. They are symbols of our faith. And what type of faith we have and how we as a society express it through our churches, through our temples, together. What we will put up with and what we are disgusted by are all a matter of national faith, and people are losing it. People have been losing it for a long time. My favorite part, my favorite scene in this entire clip is watching John Kerry, Skull and Bones, talk about that's the most Marxist, totalitarian doctrine I've ever seen in my life.
That the ends do, in fact, are justified by the means. That's the most Marxist, totalitarian doctrine I've ever heard of in my life.
And he was talking about Republicans. For good's sakes, man, he was talking about Ronald Reagan, the most conservative of conservative Republican presidents. That's the most Marxist, totalitarian doctrine I've ever seen in my life. And he's not exactly wrong. See, the right side of our government is completely okay with taking away liberties and individual freedoms of people abroad, of spying on people, of destroying their lives through illegal means. Just keep our state safe. Just keep it all good here at home. We don't care how many people you have to hurt for the better good, for the good of our community, for the good of our communist state. We don't care who has to suffer abroad. That's what the right in this country, in America, tells you. And what is the left? What is their doctrine? What do they say? Oh, it's okay to spy on us if we have nothing to hide. If we have nothing to fear, then we shouldn't have anything to hide. It's okay to take away our rights, our liberties. Just give us a safer state. Just give us a safer state. That's all I care about. It's kind of funny how those two ideas end up chasing each other until we don't have any rights left. The only reason it's funny is because if it didn't make you laugh, it would make you cry. It would make you cry. And again, I wish to hit on my persistence about a court of law, about these temples, about these statues, about these judges. I implore you to wake up and recognize what the problems are, and to recognize the fact that if we cannot get courts of law at home, in our own backyard, we're never going to get it nationally. We're never going to get it at the highest levels of the federal government, whose actual job it is to communicate with other nations on the state's behalf. If the states cannot get the rule of law upheld locally, then why would they ever be able to get upheld on a federal level? It just doesn't make any sense. And if we uphold the rule of law on the local level, on the level of the county and the state, all of the people that go to the federal system, they gotta come from a state of some sort. We don't just let Chinese nationalists get into those positions of office. It's kind of illegal and criminal, just like bribing them to do what you wish for them to do in those offices. China. But as long as we control the people who watch themselves, we don't really got to worry about it that much. That's probably what China's thinking. That's probably what China's thinking. And if we can't get courts of law on the local level, if we can't do things like make sure that women who have had their children snatched and kidnapped get them returned, that military veterans don't get arrested for taking their children camping, that people don't go to jail when they didn't know they were not driving without a license. I got back from witnessing a court where the government officers admitted to trespassing and violating the law to get the evidence that they presented in court. And the jury was perfectly fine with that. That is how far this idea of being okay with the means Americans have become. Because the only thing that jury said to the government is it's okay if the government breaks the law, but nobody else can break the statutes that the government tells us to obey and follow, that the temples tell us to obey and follow. And just to prove that point home, we're going to talk about the next episode, the next video that's going to be coming your way, and how it 100% proved that the CIA was helping protect the drug traffickers to the United States.
We saw a complete failure, perhaps one of the most shameful examples of how the mainstream press can operate in destroying a fellow journalist for getting at an important story. And Webb suffered mightily for this.
But as people got more and more lost in the minutiae of attacking or defending Webb's journalism, the focus on the CIA's involvement in the drug trade began to get lost. A fact that internal CIA documents held up as a good example of managing a public relations nightmare. But in 1998, the CIA's own Inspector General released a report essentially admitting that many elements of the Dark Alliance story were true, that the agency had known that people linked with the Contras were importing cocaine, had done nothing to stop them, and had even protected them from it.
Because not only do we let the government get away with war crimes, we also allow them to get away with drug offenses to finance their war crimes. And why don't I say drug crimes? Why do I say drug offenses? Because drugs are not a crime. It's a personal decision that only affects the end user. And this is one of the ways that the government, the system, has gotten us to view each other, to judge each other in a discriminatory light, so that we will convict each other and allow them to get away with these crimes against us. They're not the enemy. You're my enemy, and I'm your enemy. That's a mentality we got to get out of if we are going to move forward as a nation. We can't fix what has already happened. We cannot go back in time and hold people accountable. I see a collapse that I believe many of my fellow Americans, of my brothers and sisters see. And there's no stopping it at this point. There is no way to stop it. It is going to happen. The only thing that we can choose is what our personal actions are going to be, what our personal responsibilities are going to be when this happens. The only thing that we can choose is whether we go out there and we try to open people's eyes. We try to get them to see this coming American collapse and get them to think about it in a new light. Or we are not. We're not. And typically people who plan on the future are better prepared for the future. They are better prepared for the future. And if you wish to do anything to help this effort, I would greatly appreciate it. All that I would ask is that you like, comment, subscribe, share this information with somebody. Talk about it with them on a personal level so that you know they watched it. And to keep participating, and obviously come back and watch more episodes. Because here at Just Conspiracy, we just wish to conspire to bring heaven down to earth. So, pretty easy, I think. One world, love, and peace.
In the 80s there was Cold War drama. We fought the commies inside Nicaragua. Our friends were the Contras, freedom was their mantra, so we sent them lots of money for guns and landmines. But Congress stopped the Contra money flow, just 'cause they moved a teeny bit of blow. But then a hero came forth, his name was Oliver North. He and Reagan went around the sissy Congress. Ollie North, Ollie North. You see, North secretly sold missiles to a harmless country called Iran that would always be a grateful ally. Then he gave the profits to the Contras. Genius! But the sales were uncovered by the press. Reagan and North began to stress. 'Cause what they did was technically high treason. But it was totally justified. North volunteered to take the blame to save Reagan from prison rape shame. The truth he did vary with his hot secretary, thanks to her shredder. He got off totally scot-free. Ollie North, he's a soldier and a hero and a novelist, and now he's on Fox News.